I want you guys.
Emily Bell, I'm Director of the Town Centre. Welcome to the Brown Institute for Media Innovation and the Town Centre Project houses this particularly updated part of Columbia Journalism School. I'm really thrilled to be here today introducing Rasmus, Kleis Nielsen, who is, I used to say he was a recent graduate of our PhD program, but I now say he's a veteran graduate of our PhD program because we've both been doing this for so long. And it's always a thrill to host the Reuters Institute here because really they were the very first centre that studied journalism from a comparative point of view. So when we were starting the Town Centre 7 years ago, there were literally no sort of peers really to look at who just looked at journalism, apart from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford. And they're great sort of role models for us, so we always sort of regard them as people that we should be following and admiring and hosting when we can. And we're here to launch the Reuters Institute Digital News Report, which I have a hard copy of, but you don't. And there's a pile in behind there. I don't know what you have to do to Rasmus to get one, but that's why that came out wrong. I didn't mean to say that. But it is also available, of course, online. And it really is a fantastic sort of touch point every year now, which looks at not just one segment of the digital news landscape, but the whole segment, if you like, the whole global comparators and how those are moving. And there is nothing else quite like it. And it always sparks a really sort of fascinating debate. So we're going to have a fascinating debate with a great panel, which Rasmus will introduce. But first of all, I'm going to hand over to him, because he will talk you through it, for those of you who don't have the hard copy. So Rasmus, let me introduce you.
Thanks very much, Emily. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. It's a real privilege to be back at Columbia again to present this year's edition of the Digital News Report. I am really here only as an ambassador, if you will, for a great team that put this together. So I want to recognize the lead author of this study, Nick Newman, as well as our research team at the Reuters Institute, Richard Fletcher and Tonis Kalagoropoulos, who's been key to producing this report that I will try to condense, if you will, into a short presentation of what we think of as some of the main findings from this up-to-date study of how people find access to digital news around the world in 2017. The Digital News Report, for those of you who are not familiar with our work, is the world's largest survey of how people access and use news across the world. There are some limitations to this study. We have no countries from Africa. We have do not have mainland China or India involved in this, but I would still say that we can be quite proud of the genuinely global reach of this project, which surveys 36 markets across the world with a combined population of more than 1.5 billion. So we have Latin America, we have North America, we have much of Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, as well as a number of markets in Asia Pacific. That really gives you a sense, if you will, of at least in free or partially free societies, relatively high levels of internet use, how news use is changing, how people get their information, and importantly also what they think of it, if you will. So the coalition behind this is, I think, an example of what a great collaboration can achieve in terms of ensuring that we have a shared basis of facts and evidence to really think about our work, either as professional journalists, which many of you will be, or for that matter, for those of us who as academics, or some of you as media executives and policymakers are thinking about the way in which media are changing and the way in which citizens navigate this landscape. This study would not be possible without the support of our many different partners, which include many of the different stakeholders in this environment. We have support from a range of different organizations, including news media like the BBC, for example, media regulators like Ofcom in the UK, technology companies like Google, as well as a range of nonprofit foundations and universities that have all partnered up with us to make this possible, which I think is necessary, well, not only in terms of bringing together the resources to provide this kind of data, but also the expertise, really trying to make sense of what this moment is like, how it's evolving over time, and how we as citizens, decision makers, and journalists can think of this, if you will, as potentially an intelligible society, rather than navigating on the basis of assumptions, assertions, or opinions. What I want to do today is I will run through what I think of as some of the key findings from this year's research. It's clear, obviously, and I want to make this very, very clear up front, that when we're dealing with a genuinely global story, 36 different markets, very different contexts, socially, politically, economically, there is not one story here. That is very clear. There are some genuine global trends, the move towards a more digital media environment, the move towards a media environment that is increasingly accessed through the smartphone, the move towards a media environment in which platform companies play a more and more important role as intermediaries, both in terms of the discovery of news, but also the business of news. These are global trends, but there are very, very important contextual variations in how these play out in different countries. So please don't take anything I say today to suggest that every single point applies in every single market that we study. But I think there are some big takeaways, and these are the ones that I would like to highlight now and then run through quickly before we turn over to discussion of some of the people who have to navigate this transformation, both from publishing companies and from platform companies. So what are the key takeaways then? I would say the first point that I want to bring out today is the move towards an environment in which what we can think of as distributed discovery is more and more important. An environment in which people increasingly come sideways to news through search, social media, and increasingly through messaging apps. And where we would argue our evidence suggests that this in fact exposes people to more diverse information than previous media environments, contrary to fears of filter bubbles that are voiced in many corners, but also an environment in which we find that people rarely recognize the publishers behind the information that they consume in this distributed environment. It is an environment in which I think when we look at this from the point of view of citizens, it's important to recognize, and from many people's point of view, is an environment where people have very little confidence in news media, but also in the digital media companies through which they access much of this information. And in some countries, like this one, also, of course, a politically very polarized environment. The third point I want to highlight today is the idea that the role of the platform companies is constantly evolving, and I think we'll have different views on this in the panel today and how we can think about this role. But in part, it's about, if you will, in some markets, what seems to be a certain saturation in terms of the number of people who use social media for news. So this is a lot of people, but we haven't seen the kind of growth this year that we've seen in the past. And a move towards other forms of platform services that help people find news, often in rather opaque ways. Importantly this year, messaging apps, and we would speculate that perhaps in the future, voice systems like Amazon Echo and Google Home. The fourth point is really the centrality of the smartphone as a defining device of digital news. And then the final point I want to cover is the business. The question of what can fund news production in this changing environment. So these are the key points that I want to cover before we turn to the panel discussion. So first, navigating a distributed environment. The first point I highlighted in terms of the key findings from this year's report is this idea that we live in an increasingly distributed environment. We asked people about a range of different ways in which they find and come across news online, and of course most people use a multiplicity of different ways of finding news. We follow up then and ask what is the main way in which you find news online, and we find there that only about a third of our respondents across the 36 markets say that going direct to the website or app of a news organization is their main way of finding news online, and 2/3 identify various forms of distributed discovery, either through search or social media, or through email newsletters and the like, as their main way of finding news online. This is a clear global trend, but as said in my introduction, it's important, of course, to recognize that there are important country-to-country variations here. I won't dwell on all of them. The report is available, and people who are interested in particular countries can dive in there. All the data is available too, if you're interested. But just if you look at the top right corner of the slide, there are some countries, like the Nordic countries, and to a smaller extent or a more limited extent, a country like the UK, where I live today, where we see highly developed and very digitally oriented media environments in which legacy brands in particular are still absolutely central to how people discover news, and where more than half of all online news users identify going direct to the website or app of a news organization as their main way of getting news online. These are generally characterized by strong media traditions, both in private sector newspapers and public sector broadcasting, as well as relatively high levels of trust in journalism. Then there are other countries, like the ones on the top right, Chile, Argentina, Hungary, and Romania, which are countries in which legacy media were always weaker. There is much lower trust, often higher levels of political polarization. And here, in many of these markets, more than half of all our respondents say that social media is their main way of getting news. There are very important variations from country to country, but a general global move towards a more distributed environment, increasingly mediated by search, social, and other platform services. Now, you all know that this development has in many corners been associated with the fear of filter bubbles, if you will. That algorithmic filtering would lead us to a world in which we would get a narrower and narrower range of information that would confirm our already existing views. This is a very important question, and I think entirely plausible fear, and indeed one I think we should be vigilant from moving forward, as we have been in recent years. But interestingly, our data suggests that when you look at the difference between people who use platform services like social media for news and people who use platform services like search for news and compare them with those who don't, then controlling for all the other factors we know matter for news use, age, interest in news, level of education, and income, we find consistently that people who embrace social media or search as amongst the ways in which they find news online are consistently exposed to more diverse news than those who don't. Those of you who are interested in the details of this can look at a piece that Richard Fletcher and I wrote for the Nieman Lab that was published this morning, where we show this applies across different services, and also importantly, it's not only about an increase in the raw number of sources of news use, but also in using news from both the left and the right. So we do not find support for the filter bubble hypothesis, but to the contrary, we find that our data suggests that distributed discovery leads to more diverse news use in the markets that we look at. But a flip side of this is a fear that we find is confirmed, which is the fear from many publishers that people will sometimes have this assumption that they find the news on Facebook and therefore the news is from Facebook as well. We've done a follow-up study where we tried to study whether people who, when we passively track the news that they access, so what URLs they go to, and then survey them within 24 hours, whether they can actually accurately recall the brand that we know from the passive tracking they actually accessed. If you went to the NewYorkTimes.com, we know that you went to the New York Times, and then if we ask you within 24 hours, can you actually remember that the story was in the New York Times? The answer to that is that if you go direct, NewYorkTimes.com, enter, 8%, more than 80% can recall that they actually got this news from the New York Times. But when people come sideways through search, for example, or through social, less than half can accurately recall where the news actually came from. So there's, of course, here a real fear, if you will, from point of view of many publishers, that people won't recognize them as the originators of the content that is consumed in these distributed environments. If we turn to this audience perspective, not only where people get their news and whether they can recall where they got it from, but what they think of it, if you will. We've asked a couple of sort of questions about people's attitudes to news in this more distributed media environment. The first one is whether people feel that social media help them distinguish between fact and fiction. And the number here is, of course, this is not a service that social media claims to provide. Facebook, for example, aims to help us connect with people, not necessarily distinguish fact from fiction. But asked about it, only about a quarter feel that social media helps them distinguish between fact and fiction. So many people get news from social media, but they do not necessarily think of this as a particularly robust way of helping them with this particular task. And interestingly, of course, we can think of some of the qualitative research and focus groups and the like. We get quotes like the one on the right here. People share without reading the information in the article. We can all, I think, recognize these fears from our private lives, these concerns from our private lives, that you see this information, but you may be quite skeptical of whether it's actually helpful. Now, importantly, we shouldn't assume that people are necessarily all that gung-ho on whether mainstream news organizations are much better at this. When we ask a similar question about news media, who generally do suggest that they help people distinguish between fact and fiction, it is a higher number, 40%, but still only a minority of our respondents across 36 markets feel that news organizations, in fact, help them distinguish between fact and fiction. So there is here, if you will, quite a widespread crisis of confidence, or a crisis of people's confidence in their ability to navigate this environment in the way in which they get information served to them. Now, of course, there are important, again, country differences here. Not so much in people's confidence in whether social media can help them distinguish between fact and fiction, but primarily in people's perception of news media organizations. So you have countries like this, where 38% say that they have a lot or some degree of trust in the news media as a whole. When you ask them about the media you use rather than their media, the figure is much higher. This is the case in all highly polarized societies. Or you have countries like the one where I live now, the UK, where the figure is somewhat higher, but there's been a real decline in recent years in terms of the number of people who say that they can trust the media. This is where the real variation is not in the perceptions of social media, but in the perceptions of professionally produced information. And we can see similar variations, if you will, in the degree to which people sort themselves into partisan groups in terms of the media that they use. So as many of you would suspect, in this country, we see a real polarization in terms of the audience for different news organizations. We have plotted them here in terms of the composition of the audience. If you're on the left side of this graph, it means that the majority of the audience for that brand identifies as being on the left politically. If you're on the right side, the majority of the audience identifies as being on the right politically. And you can see, if you will, a real sort of risk of a disconnect between a few sources that are widely used by people on the right, and then a majority of news organizations who do not think of themselves as being on the left. They will think of themselves generally as objective and impartial, but predominantly have a left-wing audience and very little common ground, if you will. The situation in the UK is a little bit different. Here we see a lot more action in the relatively sort of centered, if you will, and a more evenly spaced out tradition of quite partisan newspapers, but perhaps less partisan than here. And then a few of these outliers, the Canary on the left and Breitbart's sort of UK operation, that are really far away from the mainstream of the media spectrum. So these are, if you will, just examples again of how the same big trends, the move towards digital, mobile, and social media environment, a high choice environment, is playing out in very different ways in different political contexts. The UK is politically polarized, but not nearly as much as here. The UK media has issues with trust, but again, not clearly, not as much as in this country. One of the factors that some people think is driving this development towards a more polarized environment is the role of platform companies. So I think we can sort of turn again to this question of the role that these companies play in how people access and find news. Of course, the first point here is to again recognize the absolute centrality of social media, and in particular, Facebook. So in the span of just 4 years, we've seen both in the US and the UK, we've seen about a doubling in the percentage of people who say that they get news via social media. This is primarily through Facebook and to some extent Twitter and other services. It's about a doubling in 4 years, and the figure by now is a majority in the US, and across the 36 countries we cover again, more than half of all respondents say that they get news through social media. It's important to note, though, that the growth we've seen in recent years is not necessarily continuing in a linear fashion. So in a number of other highly developed and mature markets, we have seen in the last year a decline or stagnation in the number of people who say that they get news from social media. So we shouldn't necessarily expect this growth to just continue. Clearly, 50% is a lot, but we shouldn't necessarily expect this to just continue into the future. I think the real interesting movement we see here when it comes to the role of platforms in helping people find and access news is not primarily through social, but really through messaging apps. So on the left side here, you have a number of different social media platforms that are all very important to various groups and to various degrees for how people find news and more broadly navigate digital media. But also importantly on the right, messaging applications who have really grown, and by now across the 36 markets we cover, 23% said that they use messaging apps for news. So for example, WhatsApp is now, across the markets we cover, more widely used for accessing and finding news than Twitter is, which is, again, quite a rapid growth and an interesting environment, right, where people now increasingly get news through environments that are private, rather than relatively public like Facebook, or much more public like Twitter, where you can actually sort of access accounts even if you aren't friends with this person. So we get these more private environments where news organizations increasingly aim to serve people with news and offer news, and of course people share news amongst themselves. And again, in these private groups or private networks that are very different from social media as we have known them in recent years. Of course, we also see companies that are particularly central. Of course, in search, it's Google, and Google also has properties like YouTube that are very important. But across Facebook's different properties, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp combined is now used by 80% of the respondents across the 36 countries we cover. So there are some companies that are clearly emerging as absolutely central players in this environment. The real action, as said, or the real change this year has been around messaging apps. And again, interestingly, we see that some markets, either markets like in Asia Pacific that have been more technologically developed than markets in North America and Western Europe, more mobile, more digital, younger populations, or markets often in Latin America, for example, or parts of Eastern Europe, where there are very, very low levels of trust in mainstream media, that messaging apps have really taken off in some of these markets, and by now are in some cases used by a majority, or at least a very large part of the population. Again, I give a few examples there, where you have 30% or more using messaging apps for news. And of course, this is just an indication, if you will, of how the role of platform companies is not really settling down. They are settling down in terms of their incredible importance for this environment, but it's constantly evolving in terms of the different services and products that they offer that users then in turn quickly turn to also for accessing and finding news. So messaging apps for this year have been sort of a breakout new development in our data, and in the future we can perhaps speculate that things like voice-activated systems and perhaps smartwatches that Apple and others have pioneered will become more important. And this, of course, is an area that the platform companies themselves are making big bets on, just as they are on, for example, virtual reality and live video. And again, I think we generally see that in many of these areas, platforms act, they develop new products and services, offer them to users, very large numbers of users, and publishers tend to react, if you will, to these developments. Mobile, next, as the fourth key area I wanted to quickly cover before we open up for the panel and then later the discussion. It is clear that in every country we cover in the report, increasingly the smartphone is the defining device of digital news. It is the device through which more and more people say they, more than anything, access their news and information. The US has been a little bit of a laggard compared to more developed markets in Northern Europe and Asia Pacific, but this year is the first year where smartphones are tied with computers, with personal computers, in terms of being the main device through which people say that they access news. And if we add on tablets, mobile devices have by now overtaken personal computers in terms of being the main device through which people access news. And through generational replacement over time, we have no doubt that this development will continue for the foreseeable future. And again, we see Asia-Pacific markets and Nordic markets being ahead of the US in this area. This is, of course, as many of us will be familiar with from our own personal lives, open up sort of new moments for potential news use, including new locations. So we've sort of asked people about where they use their smartphone to access news. I think most of us in this room will wonder, who the hell are these people who don't use their smartphones in bed? Who are these people who don't use them in various other more or less private or public situations? But it's a real opportunity, if you will, sometimes for these moments of found time that social media and other digital services have been so good at filling with compelling content, but news organizations themselves, of course, are also increasingly targeting. And we do find that when we look at news organizations, I think it is important to remember that while one narrative about what's going on right now is sort of about the inexorable rise of platforms and the inevitable decline of publishers, and of course, there are some tendencies in that direction if you look at the advertising market, for example, the share of attention. But it's also, I think, important to recognize that there are a number of news organizations and markets around the world that are very aggressively fighting for their share of attention in these more distributed and more mobile environments. And we see this very clearly, for example, when we look at the growth of mobile apps and mobile alerts, which is one of the ways in which publishers are fighting back to retain their role in people's lives, their direct connection, and to provide compelling and convenient services, ways of offering up their content to people in this more mobile environment. And again, in a number of markets, we see real growth in the importance of mobile apps and mobile alerts, though I should note here that this is a little bit of a winner-takes-all dynamic in most markets that have had a relatively limited number of often quite resourceful and prominent news brands are doing quite well in this environment, whereas many smaller organizations and perhaps primarily local organizations are really struggling to find a space in this more mobile environment. The final issue I wanted to quickly run through is this question of who's going to pay. Because much of this is about the distribution, it's about the audience's perception and attitudes towards the news and the services and channels through which they encounter news. But of course, there is also a question of the funding for this production. Here, I think the results are a bit mixed, if you will. That is clearly still a very challenging environment. Not quite the doom and gloom that some have predicted as sort of the end of news, the end of professional journalism, but clearly still a very challenging environment. More and more news organizations, as advertising becomes more and more competitive, are moving to pay and trying to present a credible value proposition where there are news and their services provided worth paying for. We see some change in this country where we can see sort of a Trump bump, if you will, a real increase in the number of people who say that they pay for news. The failing New York Times being one of the beneficiaries of this development. But in most other markets, it is at best incremental progress. Some incremental growth in the number of people who subscribe, but no significant rise in the headline figures. Again, here, the numbers vary a lot by country. So we see, if you will, a development that's quite hard to sort of account for, but to really sort of understand what exactly is driving this. But broadly speaking, a tendency where in markets where you have a combination of historically strong legacy media, high levels of trust, and if you will, the confidence to actually try to charge for things like the Nordic countries, you have by now a minority, but a significant minority of the population paying for digital news. This is Norway, for example, a leading market, whereas there are many other markets in which you have a combination of other factors, either historically weak legacy organizations, often combined with lower levels of trust, and also, if you will, some hesitation about trying to charge for content in an environment where the majority of news is still offered for free at the point of consumption from public service media, from commercial broadcasters, and from many pure players. We see much more limited progress in terms of convincing people to pay for news. So the UK is the lowest in Europe, for example, as a very competitive market. Some good news here, however, which is that the idea that we live in a culture of free where no one wants to pay, in particular young scamps who don't know the value of proper journalism, I think is clearly wrong. We see no relationship between age and willingness to pay for online news. And indeed, we see in general that younger people are more likely to pay for digital content and services more broadly. And I think in some ways it's quite encouraging for news organizations that they try to think of ways of charging for news online, that if people have a reference price for digital content and digital services that's above zero, which they do have if they pay for Netflix and Spotify, it is more likely that you can also convince them to pay for news. And indeed, as said, we find many young people, including this charming participant in one of our focus groups in the US, who actually pay for news despite the fears that a younger generation was sort of permanently lost for professional journalism. Another quick, perhaps positive finding from this year is that the fears that app blocking would sort of spread like wildfire is also, I think, somewhat damped here. We don't see quite the rise of people that anticipate in this area. And also, interestingly, when we ask people about whether they have ever turned off an app blocker for a specific site, we see that actually quite a number of people, 43%, said they have temporarily disabled their app blocker specifically for news sites, primarily because it was the only way to access content that they wanted. There are a number of news organizations, in particular in Europe, who have relatively aggressively pursued the strategy of asking people with app blockers to turn it off if they want to access the site, and actually found that significant numbers of people are willing to do that. So mixed picture in terms of the business, clearly very challenging environment, but young people paying for news and people are willing to turn off the ad blocker if the content is compelling enough. These, I think, are positive signs. Okay, I'm going to end just with a few what I think of as key questions here, and then I'll invite the panelists to join. We'll kick off the discussion with people who, unlike me, don't have to simply understand this, but also forge a way ahead for their companies, so the people have the much tougher job than me. But a few key questions, perhaps, before we light them up. I think there is a question that is a shared concern for platform companies and publishers, and to some extent researchers who want to make a practical difference, if you will, is how we can help people navigate in these increasingly complex and distributed environments. I think there is a question where platform companies and news media, I think increasingly are thinking about whether they can together do something and address some of these issues around trust and credibility in news and information, the ways in which we access this. Of course, people should only trust these things if they are in fact trustworthy. We don't want people to be deluded optimists, but if some of these players are actually trustworthy, then it is probably a problem if people are hardened cynics. We have an issue of what are the responsibilities for platforms like Facebook, Google, and Twitter in this environment where they are clearly more and more important intermediaries for how people find and access news, as well as for the business of journalism. We have a question for publishers themselves. As this move to mobile continues apace, and is clearly the direction of travel, are publishers aggressively enough pursuing these opportunities to serve people who access news primarily through mobile platforms? And finally, are there new opportunities for news providers to make money online? So I have all the questions, and the people that I will invite to join me on the stage now have, I'm sure, all the answers. So please, I will invite our fantastic panel up to join me now, so which is a slightly magical slide, but Emily Bell is the director of the Talent Center. Please, Melissa Bell, publisher of Kalita, Mitra, Kalita, vice president of programming at CNN Digital, Nikita Patel, partnership manager of news at Twitter, and Jason White, manager of U.S. news partnerships at Facebook. So I will kick off with a few questions for the panelists and back and forth amongst us, and then we will open it up for questions from the floor. So thank you very much for your attention. Okay, so I have a rough idea for what we should do now, so let me glance at that rough idea. Okay, let's start with this question of platforms, perhaps. Emily, since you're the host, I'll turn to you. I mean, you have you've expressed your views very clearly on some of these issues. I presented some data today that suggests that whatever there are other consequences, the platform companies are also helping people discover more diverse news and information, which I should note is particularly the case for younger people and people with limited interest in news. Do any of these findings sort of change your views on the responsibility of platform companies?
No, not really. I mean, in some ways, they kind of harden them a little bit in that. Well, it's unfair to say that I've been critical of the platforms. It's more a constant drumbeat of they are now in the business really of sort of distributing and in some ways publishing news, and they do shape how we see the world. And when you look at, you're talking about the sort of the 80% share more or less of Facebook products across sort of several markets. You can't really kind of ignore that influence. What I would say is that in the year we've just had, so since we last got together and talked about this, the actual, the platforms have, particularly Facebook, have had a real sort of, I think, not necessarily an epiphany, but they've certainly changed internally how they address these issues, externally how they're communicating them, how they integrate with the news market, and they've acknowledged that there are some real problems. I mean, one thing that was missing from this, I'll stop in a second, which is you touched on it, Rasmus, but I think as I page through the report, we see that you have sort of local big media doing well, and you have global brands, kind of holding good share. So local is not thriving in the current environment, and actually Facebook were one of the platforms who said, we're actually really worried about this, and we want to help it. So it doesn't make me think that platforms are less influential or it's changing. It just makes it obvious, if you like, that there is a pact now where Facebook and the publishing industry and Twitter and Google all have a shared interest in high quality information reaching audiences. And I think that a year ago, even though that might have been tacit understanding, I'm not sure it would have been sort of expressed together. But I mean, as I say, sort of, I think that other people may have different views on that.
Thanks, and I think this is probably where we should turn to Jason and Nikita as representative of platforms. I mean, it's clear that most publishers come rushing every time you launch a new product. They would very much like to be part of this because you have a very large user base compared to every publisher in the world. But the criticism normally also falls very quickly. We would like more editorial control, we would like access to more data, and we would rather like to have sustainable business. So Jason, attribution, lower than half of people say they recognize brands they get news from on social media. The business is very tough. Much of that advertising money goes to you. People are concerned about whether you can help people implementing pay models. Should they hope for progress in these issues?
So definitely a lot of questions wrapped up in that one question. So when we launched the Facebook Journalism Project in January, one of the things we committed to is what we call collaborative product development. And a key piece of that was facilitating support for emerging business models. Among those, we cited video, because there's a huge increase in video publishing. You see newspapers now investing in the video business. You see a lot of digital publishers becoming actual video-first companies as well. And something we have started testing since we launched the project in January is video monetization through an ad break. We are committed to finding a sustainable business model for video publishers via our platform. Another thing we expressed an interest in back in January was finding new ways to support subscriptions. We've heard from our publishing partners like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Guardian, and so on, that digital subscriptions are a key way, if not the way, that they are going to support their businesses in the future. Many of them use our platforms effectively today to drive audience. They get people to their websites where they put up a paywall and convert them. It's a very core part of the value proposition for why they use Facebook. What we're interested in exploring is if there are other things that we can do. Are there other ways we can use our media products like instant articles to support their subscription business? One partnership we did was with Bild, the German publisher. We actually, within instant articles, created a free trial call to action function, where readers within there was no paywall, but they could sign up for a free trial subscription to Bild. Bild would then have that person's contact info, and they could upsell them to a paying subscription when the free trial ended. Very, very early in that, but those are the kinds of efforts that we are committed to exploring with the industry.
Thanks, Jason. These are some of these issues I think are relevant for your work at Twitter as well. I mean, I looked just this morning, for example, at Twitter Moments, which is great for discovery, but also had to click quite a few times before I could see the brand behind the content I was being served. How are you thinking about this in your work and your relationship with publishers?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi everyone. We feel at Twitter that we have, great responsibility in publishing, and in our strategies, we've sort of always had a living, breathing version of the Facebook Journalism Project. I'm a big fan of what you guys are doing, but we've always been kind of doing that, right? Training, gathering feedback from our partners, really making sure that their feedback is baked into the products. And our sort of mission, so I'm on the news vertical at Twitter, and that's part of the Global Content Partnerships Org, and our mission is to work with partners around reach, revenue, and innovation. And so that is baked into everything that we do. And we feel very strongly that, hordes of people come to Twitter for news, so we have to continue to iterate to do a better job of surfacing that quality information. And so, I'm proud to say that we've done great partnerships too with the likes of the folks at Vox. We've done some great live stuff with them. We're going to have more coming. And with CNN, we work with them continuously with regards to distribution. So, we really want to hear our partners' feedback. We want them very much involved in projects that we're working on that, again, really help bridge that gap between the audience and the products. And so highlighting brands and really bringing that out is key to us. And we actually do have some changes with them coming that will hopefully help to illustrate that.
Can I ask, maybe before we turn to Melissa and Mitra's experience of this from the publisher side of things, Nikita, you and perhaps you, Jason, too, what do you think of this issue that Emily raised about local versus top brands? So you mentioned Bild as an example, very, very strong legacy brand in Germany. You mentioned CNN as an example. And I can definitely see a future scenario in which this works out quite well for the strongest brands, whether they are digital-born like Fox or legacy brands like CNN, but where this becomes very, very tough for smaller players, whether they are digital-born niches or whether they are local legacy media, whether broadcast or print. So how do you think about that at Twitter, this tension between the local and the dominant national and international brands?
Sure, that's a great question. So I have to oversee partnerships for news here in the US, and that means I travel a lot. That means I go to different states and go to different newsrooms, and oftentimes we spend a whole day, right, doing Periscope bootcamp, moments training, TweetDeck 2.5, since that product has continued to evolve over the years. And it's very important that our partners feel like, we don't necessarily always do big meaty projects with the biggest media organizations. I think it's, we like to reflect that in our partnerships to recognize that the landscape has such a rich tapestry. So, on any given day, a local radio station might get in touch and want best practices and things, whereas a different newspaper halfway across the country will want to kind of have a conversation about live video and how they can be part of our efforts there. And so, we have obviously journalists far and wide across the country using the platform in many different ways, of course, often being the first to share breaking news, and then sometimes those stories obviously become national. And so that is something we definitely want to foster and nurture.
So I was a journalist before I joined Facebook about 4 years ago to work in the partnerships team, and like many, I got my start in local news. My first newsroom job was the New Haven Register, covering the small town of Derby, Connecticut. I got paid $40 per story, which as a graduate student was pretty good. Enabled me to buy a little beer and coffee on the side. So I've long been interested in local news, passionate about it, but also very well aware that its economic prospects have not been great. Even when I graduated in 2001, looking for my first full-time job, I thought I would go work for a local newspaper. 2001, newspapers, this is many, many years ago, newspapers were struggling mightily at that time, in part due to Craigslist and just due in part to the internet existing and struggling to find a sustainable business model even at that time. So there's been a long story of challenges that local news is facing. So at Facebook, this past half, from January to now, local has actually been a huge focus. So we've done 6 regional news days where we've gotten out of New York City, out of the media bubble here, and set up shop in Dallas, Atlanta, Seattle, San Diego, Denver, and Chicago to do seminars, day-long events for local media. And one of the things that we've learned through these, as these folks come to us with their questions about how they can better leverage our platform, is that we're already driving a lot of value to them. They depend to a significant extent on Facebook to support their digital business. Local TV also uses it to promote their on-air work, to promote their talent. So we're already very well integrated in a big part of their business. That doesn't mean there isn't more we can do. We have hired a product manager to actually focus specifically on local news, to see if there's something more that we can build that is unique for local. Because it is an unusual space. At Facebook, we care deeply about helping to foster informed communities. Mark wrote this large manifesto a few months back. It was about 8,000 words, so I certainly understand if you haven't read it, the whole thing. But informed communities was a big part of that. And in order to have an informed community, you need a strong and healthy local news ecosystem. There have been challenges for 2 decades now, and I think a lot of those challenges are going to continue from what we hear in our conversations with local. But there are some bright spots. You see a newspaper like the Boston Globe growing its digital subscription business. You see the Minneapolis Star Tribune, which after struggles many years ago, feels like they're turning a corner there. And they have a pretty vibrant business and a vibrant newsroom. So I'm hopeful that some of those models can be brought out to other of the big metro and then small town and city newspapers. It's good for all of us if local news is thriving.
As Jason said, many publishers feel increasingly that they depend on platform companies like Facebook and Google and to some extent Twitter for much of their digital distribution and business. We think we should turn to the publisher perspective here, Mitra and Melissa. I think many of you will have seen the article in Bloomberg a few days back where Jason Clint said that news media organizations increasingly are serfs working for Facebook. So I suppose I should ask Mitra and Melissa whether you feel like serfs in this 21st century digital media environment, whether you have a different vision of yourself. Mitra, do you want to go first?
I just want you all to see that Facebook just handed me the mic, though. because my boss is also quoted in that article. Do I feel like a serf to Facebook? I don't actually. I feel like a serf perhaps to its users, which is a very different proposition than the platform versus its users. And the way I think about this, strategically, our readers are there. And so a lot of folks are planning for an environment where we will one day be distributed. It's sort of talked about as a goal. I think places like CNN, I feel very fortunate, and the slide that you just saw confirms that we're already there, right? Was it 65% are consuming media in a distributed environment? So that ship has sailed. So I think of the platform as a place that I need to be to create habits, to create a habit of consuming journalism. And so whether it's Facebook or Snapchat or Twitter or Kik, we will figure out how we get CNN content to these users. The second way I think about it, of course, is traffic. And there's part revenue play in there, but there's also just the reality of driving you from this habit that you might create in one ecosystem into mine, because I happen to be really fortunate in having a day in, day out reader, and you have a website that's going to serve you in a very holistic manner pretty well. So I want you to come and see what we have to offer. The third, which we never talk about in these situations, but I think is really important, especially now, is for news gathering. So it used to be called UGC, and user-generated content, but in a breaking news situation, the platforms, to me, are crucial. Now, they're also very dangerous, as Nikita just talked about verifying information on Twitter. And so for me, the journalism comes into play here because during a Manchester attack or a stabbing in Flint, Michigan, there's a flurry of information, and these users are often sharing as well as consuming on these platforms. And the CNN enters and commits the journalism. These three areas are all user-driven, though. They happen to be on platforms that are enormous platforms, and that's why it might start to feel like we're serfs to Facebook. The last area that I look to platforms for is inspiration, and that's kind of the fuzzy, warm relationship that you and I can have, because I think you all adapted very quickly to what people want, how they want to consume, what is the content they identify with, in a way that journalism was a little bit slow to do. And so the reason I'm grateful to platforms is that they force a dialogue, right? Literally, it is a place of community building and readers talking to each other and us talking to our audiences. And so I start to take lessons from that back onto my platform. And so something like messaging, which I'm elated to see is doing so well because that's a dialogue with our audiences, comes onto my platform, so the day after election day, I can open up a voicemail line and 10,000 people call me to tell me how they're feeling, right? So CNN becomes a lot more personal. Does that kind of give you a lay of whether I'm feeling like a serf or not?
That's quite a powerful way of putting it. You're not a serf to platforms, you're a serf to the public, which is historically, I suppose, not
I think that's what we're supposed to be.
As a journalist or a news organization. Melissa.
Mitra is an old colleague, and I always love to talk about it because I always am like, yes, she's so great. And I think that is, I think that actually is like a very, very important point. I think that for a very long time, and sometimes still today, we forget that our job is to be a service to our audience and a service to people who are seeking information. And I think that what has changed in the last year is that I think Facebook was really, they've always had a bit of an eye towards news and journalism, but I think they were really thinking about a service of connecting people to their friends and family. And I think what's shifted really dramatically in the last year is that they have recognized that they are also needing to think about how they are a service in terms of information distribution. I think Twitter has also gone through a bit of that shift in the last year as well. I think there's an energy on the platform side to see that there are far more complicated problems in today's environment around information clarity, around misinformation campaigns, around the danger inherent in this inundation of news and content that we have. And I think that I think we're now converging where we both recognize that these are the problems that we really have to fight, whether it's around the kind of quality journalism that we're doing on the publisher side, or the kind of environments that are being built on the platform side. I think that Mark Zuckerberg, in his 8,000 word diatribe, which I did read, is clear about his own confusion and his own uncertainty about how to handle an environment of 2 billion people, and what that means in terms of the way that the world embraces news. I think that the model that we have at Vox Media, it's actually, I think that a lot of the things you guys have touched upon are incredibly important to us. We have a very strong commitment to local journalism with sites like Curve and Eater and SB Nation. We have a very strong commitment to finding, how to create deeply engaged audiences around certain topics that they care about. And then the question is, how do we reach them? How do we make sure that we're getting them the right information? And how are we building a relationship with them there to get to the trust question? Because that's really what we need to start to work on, is not to start working on, I feel like we've been working on that for years, is continuing to say to them, we're here to provide a service for you, and we're doing this because our job is to provide clarity and deep reporting and deep information gathering for you. And I think that got lost in the last 10 years of digital transition. And I think it's a really exciting time right now because it feels to me as if journalism organizations are saying, we can do this work. It's a very hard job to do journalism, quality journalism, and we're here to do that work. And I think platforms are saying, okay, how do we adjust and solve some of the questions that we haven't been asking ourselves in the past? And so I'm excited about where we are. In terms of the relationship of serfdom or non-serfdom, I think that sometimes we like to be a bit hyperbolic in our descriptions in journalism and media presentations, and this is one of the things that we need to work on. I really think that consistently we need to consider ourselves business partners, and we need to think of this as business partnerships. It's not whether you're a friend or a foe or a frenemy or a serf or any other term that is a little cutesy terminology for we're not really sure what to do with you people. It is a business partnership that we need to work together to solve some of the massive challenges that change has brought to us right now.
I think it's important in terms of some of those other massive challenges that aren't primarily on technology and business, but also the issue that Liz has a wonderful essay about this in the report, but the question of trust, really. I mean, Mitra wants an informed public, Mark Zuckerberg wants an informed public, you all want an informed public, I want an informed public, everyone's mother wants an informed public. But it seems from our data, and I think a lot of other research too, and a lot of journalistic impressions of how many people feel, that a lot of people don't feel particularly empowered in this environment and don't necessarily trust platform companies or publishers' ability to help them navigate this environment. So, if you want to take a stab at this question of how different actors can play a more constructive role in this environment where so many people seem to feel so skeptical, really, of the role that you all, and for that matter, my own profession as academics, surely too, play in our society.
Sure, yeah, I think that the sort of spread of misinformation is really, it's a problem not only for platforms, but obviously news organizations and across the web. It's a much larger issue, and I feel like one of the biggest ways to solve this is by coming together. And that is why I think, organizations like Personal Views exist, because again, they're convening all of these different entities to try to come up with strategies and solutions. And all of that is being done through collaboration, which I think is really powerful. From the Twitter perspective, I will say that we deeply care about misinformation and surfacing quality content on the platform. Every single day we see journalists, newsrooms, engaged citizens fact-checking and debunking things in real time. And that, I think, speaks to the sort of relevancy of having these critical conversations on our platform as a way of exposing and highlighting the truth. And I think that goes, hand in hand with all these journalists doing that in real time, all these newsrooms. And so, we hope that the more that these instances, occur, especially as news is breaking, that we just continue to keep surfacing all the best stuff across the platform, and also harnessing the fact that our platform is so diverse. It's a question of exposing diverse perspectives as well as the truth, and I think that is really reflective of our community on the platform.
Misinformation on Facebook, first it wasn't a problem, and then suddenly it was a huge problem, and where have we landed on this? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think, and Nikita spoke to this a bit, but I think that this is an industry challenge. It's one that's not unique to social media, not unique to messaging platforms, not unique to news, not even unique to our general industry, period. There is a breakdown of trust, government leaders, other public institutions, and so on. That's just been happening for decades now. When you look at the data, you take a book like Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, which is a classic work of sociology that dug into some of this. But in the spirit of partnership, we've actually done a few things to start trying to address some of these issues. So I see Eric Carbon in the room from the Associated Press. We launched a number of partnerships with third-party fact-checking organizations back in December. Here in the US, there were 5 of them. The Associated Press was one of those. This was a product that enabled users to flag stories that they thought were problematic, that they thought might be false news. We surfaced them to external news organizations who have expertise in vetting this kind of content, and they can then deem those stories true or false. It's a very early product. We've done some experimentation with this. We've also brought it out to France, thinking about what else we can do to address the challenges through third-party fact-checking. We've made some newsfeed changes to go after the business of false news purveyors. We find in many cases it's not ideologically driven, or the equivalent of scam artists, and they're just trying to make a quick buck. So we've made some ranking changes that depress clickbait content and also depress ad farms. So oftentimes you get these false news stories, someone might click through, a little bit of content, whole lot of ads. We have ways to detect that and make sure that those are being surfaced to fewer and fewer people over time. By no means are any of these permanent and total solutions to the challenge, and I think there's a lot of interesting dialogue going on with organizations like First Draft with our news partners about what more can be done. So I think you're going to see more on this in coming months from us and from others, because it really is an industry challenge at this point.
Bringing Emily here and now here, she turns to Mitra and Melissa, because it's clear that this issue of misinformation and trust is not only a question of platforms. I mean, there's also a lot of people who say that journalism has been complicit with amplifying some of this misinformation, and it's clear that many people don't have a lot of confidence in professional journalists' abilities to inform the public. But Emily, and then we'll turn to Mitra and Melissa and open up for questions.
So I had time to reflect, and I thought my first answer was way too nice to the platform, so I'm kind of like decided to have that go at that. But so on this question of trust, I think there are 2 things that happen here. First of all, I don't think the way that we measure trust is very useful anymore. Actually, it's often a proxy for fragmentation. It can be a proxy for people just being more skeptical and cautious. And I think, Rasmus, the point you made about we don't want to be hard on cynics, but we also don't want that. I mean, 74% of people who watch Fox News trust what it says. You know, so when we talk about building trust in media, what are we talking about? To me, it's like the difference between good reporting and bad reporting. And the question is, how do we support good reporting? And platforms, whether they like it or not, have accidentally, I'm going to say accidentally because I'm being kind to them again, designed a system which has an incentive structure that does not reward good reporting. You know, it rewards things which are easily shareable. We know from research that people share things which cause outrage. You know, so there's a fascinating study of when congressmen posted things on Facebook. If they were doing so in a kind of a relatively sort of, you know, kind of moderate tone, their social kind of activity was pretty low. The more they did towards outrage, the more it was liked or shared or clicked. And that's what earns you money and gets you attention. You know, the whole system is built on that. So, you know, kind of, the platforms have a huge responsibility here. I think it's not about fact checking. I mean, that's great, and I think all of those initiatives are wonderful. But until you start to reward good, investment in good, consistent reporting from organisations that employ journalists, you're not going to change really sort of anything about sort of the metrics of trust. And I think that's a huge problem. I think it's a design problem. I think it's much more fundamental than just some of these stories are right, some of them are wrong. We all know the stories that are being shared very widely at the moment are done so because they bolster people's perspectives and because they get enormous kind of uptake on social media. And that finding a way, I mean, Melissa's phrase about it being a business partnership is spot on. Finding a way in that partnership of saying, okay, so there's a problem here, which is we don't have the right incentive structure.
Thank you. Let's hear from Mitra and Melissa, and then we'll open up for questions from the floor. Mitra, do you want to? Oh, sorry.
I'm going to talk badly about television, so do you want to go through it?
No, because I'll read that, but yeah.
Okay, I won't. Go ahead, Melissa. I mean, so not to denigrate all television, but I think that we spend a lot of time talking about digital. Obviously, this is a digital news report. We are focused on technology companies. We're speaking about the platform's role in this. But you mentioned Fox News and their, and I think that in the U.S. we have to take a very hard look, and I do not think that we take a hard enough look at the role television plays in the news media industry overall. I think that we had a company, Fox News, startup 30-some years ago, that was a very monetarily driven company that wanted to play an advocacy role in its journalism. And while they grew around a strong entertainment-based approach to news, the rest of the news industry did not adjust in response to that in any way. And I think, I spoke about this in Oxford, where Roger Ailes had a marketing mind, and he came in and he used the term fair and balance in such like a winking way to his audience to sort of tease out that there's no objectivity. And so as he pushed this question of whether or not the news media can be trusted further and further towards the answer that he thought was no, we have, with the rest of the media industry, not adjusted ourselves and really changed the way that we create work and produce work. And I think that it has created a massive issue for us in the U.S. Where you speak two different, there's a possibility of different facts to different audiences, and that to me is so incredibly troubling. And I think it comes to how many people engage with television as a main format. And so it's on us to really look at that and say, how does that impact the way that platforms are designed, to your sense, like the sensationalism, that is a direct descendant of like the entertainment-based television news industry. And I don't use the term entertainment lightly. They really are creating an entertainment business. And so that I think is something that we need to take a hard look at and really think about what is our approach to that, and how do we talk about that, and how do we make some strong suggestions to our friends at television companies that they need to think about that as well.
I actually wouldn't disagree. If I didn't believe in the power of television and image, I wouldn't be working at CNN. I mean, I have worked in a lot of places, and I ended up here because I do believe in the ubiquity of a CNN, and when we call something a fact is a very, very powerful thing. We take that very seriously. And so, actually, I wouldn't disagree with you. I think for us, the issue of, I'm glad we're talking about trust versus truth. I think trust and facts are the words that we're trying to work in a little bit more. And the area I already talked about, just opening ourselves up in our journalism, right? Making it feel like there is a human behind what we are doing has been one way of gaining trust, right? Why am I more likely to share my uncle's post that is fake versus sharing a brand like CNN, right? That's a question that I think we need to contend with. And so there's some of that on platforms, but there's also some of it on, well, how open were we to the user in that transaction? I would also say that some of it is, you're seeing anchors like Jay Tapper, you're seeing our journalism, just as far as how it's gathering facts, a lot more transparent about why they do it, how they got the story, and I think this is a piece of it. We also just added a media reporter, Oliver Darcy, onto our media team, working through CNN Money. And the expansion of the media team here was not to cover like who's going to be on the masthead of the New York Times next, but it's actually to cover media in a much more holistic sense. And so Oliver did some great reporting on the shooting of the DNC staffer down in DC that a lot of right-wing outlets were kind of taking up, and there was a lot of fake news around that. And so the addition of a media reporter to actually do journalism on these stories with the hope that if the slide we just saw is correct, that you're not consuming in bubbles, you're actually consuming stories that maybe are the stories that are within your bubbles, and stories that are actually giving you more fact might be more likely to be shared in those circles, right? And so could we penetrate those circles, which leads me to my last area of transition in our newsroom, which is one of representation. And Nikita talked about this as far as the diverse voices that platforms represent to us. But until we figure out a way that people are seeing themselves in media, then this entire proposition and all of this talk about gaining trust, and you can interview tens of thousands of people and put out hundreds of pages of reports, but until we really figure out a way that people are seeing themselves in journalism, whether that's the point of view or the bubbles they live in, or race or gender or sexual orientation, or all, I mean, this is not going to be one of those kind of touchy-feely diversity things, but I think on that we've really, really failed. So on that uplifting note, I'm going to hand it over to Facebook.
No, I think we should open it up here for questions. This has been a terrific conversation already, but we want to broaden it out. So when you ask a question, please speak up, say who you are, and direct your questions to one of the panelists. And we will start the gentleman at the back there.
Yes, my name is Jim Ding, and I'm a senior editor of Pacific Radio. My question would be, how do we deal with the bridging differences of Americans right now? Because everything we've said for the past 30 minutes,
Facebook or Twitter or any other. And you do it in a way that can create a little bit of community, but can also serve your larger interest as an organization that needs to tell stories and connect with folks and create that more informed community.
Hi, Ron Feaster. I graduated from here in '92 and I teach journalism at Florida Office in State College. I have two questions. One, where does India on this? Huge journalism market. I wonder if you looked at it. It's one of India.
Yeah,
It's one of the places that's growing on paper and on phone, and not on the internet. It's a very interesting combination, particularly the non-Hindi, non-English communities in India have a vibrant paper journalism. And the second question is, did you control at all for the size of communities and the size of language communities and for other things that affect polarization like income inequality? Because a lot of the countries that are at the bottom of your polarization scale would also be countries that have very low income inequality compared to, say, the United States.
Okay, great. These are for me. So two quick ones on India first. We would like to cover India. We would have to do that as a face-to-face survey because of the still limited nature of internet penetration there. And we would like to do it on the basis of funding that comes without political strings attached, which is hard. So we would like to include India, but we aren't quite there yet. We have done a couple of reports. I'll send you, if you give me your email, on digital journalism startups in India, like Scroll or Print, as well as newspapers, digital transformation, like the Nielsen Times and Manrano and others. So we do work in India. The second point you made, I'm really glad that you raised that, because that was my thought to supplement Jim's question and the responses from here, is that one divide that we find is as pronounced, and in many countries more pronounced, than the one between the political left and the political right, is between those who feel marginalized from mainstream society and those who don't, and that is highly related to class. So income, people with low income, limited formal education, and often a precarious position in the labor market are very often people who feel marginalized from many parts of society, including news and journalism. So that's a very clear issue in many countries. Please.
Hi, so I'm Angela Woodall. I'm a PhD student here in communication studies, and I was a reporter for a decade. And in my experience, and I have used social media in so many different ways, management has a very critical lack of critical analysis of social media, how it's being used in the newsroom. So they'll treat it as a silver bullet. So I'm wondering if you, Mr. White and Mr. Todd, can talk about how the changes recently to the algorithms, and this gets to what Emily mentioned, affect what we can see, what we're likely to see and what we can see. Because that's really a very critical thing. If I'm getting, so I wonder if
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think fundamentally at Facebook, so people, first thing that most people see when they open up Facebook is their newsfeed. So what's in their newsfeed? It's stories that have been shared by their friends or by brands that they're connected to. So there is that sense of connectivity already with what people are seeing. We don't just sort of randomly flash up pieces of content to people. We have started experimenting recently though, and this is on the information diversity point, with some serving up related articles. So for topics that we know are especially hot, they might be a trending topic, and someone might have one point of view served up to them in their newsfeed because they're a fan of that page, we'll actually surface some related points of view below, but that are from more diverse perspectives. It's a small test. It's just one way to try to get at that sort of challenge. But I totally, hear what you're saying about what people are seeing in their feeds and the role that algorithms play. But at the end of the day, and I think this is the really important point that was made at the beginning, Facebook is a collection of people, it's individual people that a publisher and newsrooms need to serve. We're just a new place and a new way that they're doing it. But it's no different than trying to get newspaper readers, trying to get people to watch you on TV, or trying to subscribe to your email newsletter. It's just another platform, another place for you to find and discover an audience.
Great question. We have done a number of different ways to sort of assist discovery. And so for the longest time, we did not tweak our algorithms. We didn't want to, because obviously we are a real-time platform. And that is why people love to, come to Twitter to discover and share, especially news. But what we realized is that in order to grow our platform and welcome new users, I think that we're only 11 years old, but we're still growing. We have to then introduce things like quality, again, like surfacing quality content based on your own network, right? And then we have things like while you were away and highlights, and these have proven to be really successful because, you know, you do miss a lot if you don't come to Twitter for a few hours. And so we've received really positive feedback on these key features because not only do they, again, highlight great stuff that you missed, they also serve a great purpose in, again, exposing these really diverse voices as well. And so, so that's been really great to see. And then you mentioned data specifically. One initiative that we're sort of focused on now is helping users understand their audiences so that they can better cater to them. And so I think that's really key because, you know, for a newsroom, let's say, like seeing on a box, understanding your own audience on your own platform is one thing, but then off platform is another. And we really, again, want to keep bridging that gap. So you should know who is consuming your video. You should know who is swiping through your moments. And that's a big initiative we're really focused on because then again, I think that will go a long way in platforms understanding what to cover and how to reach their diverse audiences as well.
Okay, since you just opened the door, that would be excellent. If we understood the users on Twitter and on Facebook and on YouTube in a consistent manner with similar metrics that made sense across all those platforms. So you two should talk after this.
Can I say as a user that I may not want them to share my data?
Yeah.
There's ways that we can, there's a lot of ways that you can anonymize data. There's a lot of confusing ways to have a 3-second view time that is different on different platforms that doesn't, that can be addressed way before you get to user data. It tells us who you are.
The question in the back there.
My name is Nielsen, and I'm working on a startup in the media space. I have a question about bias in the news. So I find that publications are politically biased, but no publication is willing to admit this. And I kind of think that if publications can't just admit it, that there's going to continue to be problems. And so my question is really about that. And I think the left-leaning media is guilty of dismissing some arguments from right-leaning media. This happens more than people I think are willing to admit. And I can give you examples. So my question is just like, why are media companies not willing to admit this? And then, I mean, I understand that there's journalistic integrity and that publications are supposed to be unbiased, but the reality is that they are biased. So,
This is Mitra.
Go ahead. I mean, I think we come out on the same on this, but let's see. I'm not sure.
She's testing me. So I really have a big anathema to the idea that objectivity is a goal in journalism because I think we have given it too much power in the last 50 years. And I think that has really confused audiences and also made audiences distrust us. I think that I think the bias exists in people. People are biased, they approach their job with biases. There's the reason why Mitra speaks eloquently around the fact that we need to have different perspectives in newsrooms and recognition of different backgrounds in newsrooms is because people bring different experiences to their work. I am going to always be interested in California because I was born there. I'm going to be interested in India because I live there. There's a reason why I bring my set of experiences to the table. One of the things that we really want to do at Vox Media is make sure that our audiences understand the backgrounds as much as they possibly can and where what is the path that our reporters have taken to get there. It's one of the benefits of the internet actually is that if you find an author like Matthew Iglesias, you can see his entire, who is a senior correspondent at Vox, one of our co-founders, you can see his entire history of work over the last 15 years, going back and seeing his essentially like his own real-time education around topics and how he's decided how to cover things. Our journalists at Recode, which is our business and technology site, they each have a personal ethic policy where they write what would be, why they might have compromises in areas that they might cover. And the reason why we want to do that is because we want our audiences to have as much information about our backgrounds and about the positions that we've come to not just say like we have all the answers. We want to say that we're developing the answers in real time. I think at some point we shifted from being the first draft of history to being the final report on history, and that has been a huge problem. So I'm totally in agreement with you, and I think that we need to have that conversation more often.
I would just add that certainly CNN is trying to own this middle space, right? That you have MSNBC and you have Fox News, and in a polarized media climate, there's a reason I'm intentionally saying, look, facts and trust are what's going to be our currency, it's our relevance. I think digital in some ways has also forced us to be less binary in the way that we're looking at issues. And for that, speaking of inspiration from Facebook, if you think about the relation status, it's complicated, right? You're either married or you're not, right? That used to be what sort of the binary existence of relationships were. And here comes along Facebook to kind of own complicacy in a relationship. And I think of news stories very similarly. That if it wasn't complicated, we wouldn't be writing about it, it wouldn't be news, and yet we continue to impose this either left or right or black or white kind of narrative on a lot of our stories. Anybody who doesn't think that the left and the right conflicting places with each other in those zones right now has been totally under a rock, right? And so for me, when we talk about bias, it's actually not as much about what side of it are you on, as much as can we address the many sides of this issue? Can we actually start to be a little more complicated and break stories down as we're telling them? So this applies, it always comes back to the story for me, because that's just how we work. That's the journalism versus, hey, we're putting it all up there and you all decide.
I would just add that your question is one reason we at Facebook and Twitter is the same, have a bias toward being an open platform. We want to allow for voices. We want to allow for new voices. That's the fact that you work for a startup. Facebook has been a great place for Vox.com to grow and find an audience. And if you're a lockdown platform and you say this publisher is good and this one is bad, you're not leaving room for the new and the different and the interesting. And especially as you get into different cultural contexts, you have totalitarian countries where those leaders would really like to have a list of good and bad publishers. And we much prefer a world where you as publishers are battling it out on our platform. And CNN is going against Fox News on Facebook just like they are on television and trying to win that audience. And it's not us picking and choosing those winners and losers. So it's a very complicated question, a complicated debate. But it is one reason our platform is the way it is.
I mean, I think that sounds great, but that's exactly why you have a massive fake news problem after the election. It's a great idea, but in practice, as you say, it's really complicated, and actually it's failed. I mean, I'm not pleased about that, because I was a real advocate of how we do journalism on the open web. The Guardian back in the day, we all thought for a good decade that this was going to solve for all sorts of problems. But it's like economics, kind of good money does not drive out bad. The opposite is true. And I think how we, this is where it's so important that we have like an open and public conversation about that being problematic. So I would push back against the simplicity of an open system, create something where the best rises, because that's absolutely failed.
I think we've got time for a last question before we break for questions. I think we'll take one in the back here. Sorry, can you speak up a bit? It's a bit hard to hear you.
Kelly Vigil from Oxford University. I just ask you one wacky question. Of Facebook's revenue kind of derives from all the content that we share on Facebook, either publishers or citizens. Because I think that's really at the heart of the problem. I used to be a journalist, and I would see my industry complete disarray, and I don't know have it tossed on either people or companies to make money from it. But you guys are making an enormous amount of money. And I think for a fact, what Emily said, like, is there a way of incentivizing good journalism organizations, or can we at least find out what platforms they work?
A lot of questions. Jason?
Thank you for that. So, we are aligned with you in wanting to support the business of publishers, and of quality publishers in particular. Instant Articles is a product we created to speed the consumption of content on mobile. You talked about how we're becoming a more mobile-first world. That is happening globally. But the consumption of content on mobile has been a broken experience. Within Instant Articles, we've made a number of monetization improvements over the past 6 months. The value of those articles is up about 50% on average, and you talked about $1 million question, we're actually paying out more than $1 million per day to publishers now. So we are very interested in supporting the business of publishers, and for publishers that have been flagged as purveyors of false content by third-party fact checkers, if they are repeat offenders of our content policies, they cannot use Facebook advertising on their websites. They cannot make money off of our advertising. So we do have policies that are trying to eliminate the worst of the worst from capitalizing on this new economy. And I would also say that yes, it's a very, very tough time for journalism broadly. There's also an amazing number of bright spots out there. You see, we talked about the rise of Vox.com. You look at what BuzzFeed News is doing. It's amazing. They are doing incredible investigative work. The analytical work that comes out of the Voxes of the world is fantastic. You have Attention, you have Mike, you have these brands that are reaching new generations, and that's just in the US alone. And these things are happening in part because they're good at taking advantage of platforms. They're going where the audience is, and they're building real and successful businesses on this. So it's not all dark and gloomy. There are some trend lines that are moving in the right direction. But yeah, it's like many things, it is complicated.
Lisa, do you want to speak to this issue of what this looks like from your side?
I'm sorry, so
Do you want to speak to this issue of what the money side looks like from the publisher point of view?
sure. I mean, I think that it would be a very bad business decision if we depended solely on Facebook for our business. It is not a sustainable business in its what is the word, solitude, as a single place. However, in a diversified revenue company, we look to it as a place where we see potential for not just audience growth, but also revenue growth. I am not going to stop investing in other areas as well anytime soon. The mid-roll is a start, so we have to keep pushing on the revenue possibilities, but it's not. But I see it as a place that we're going to continue to invest in. I mean, there's no doubt about it. We make money off of our audiences on Facebook. We're going to continue to see growth there. But we can't just think of it, again, I think that somebody in the audience mentioned this. Facebook is not the silver bullet for saving journalism. Journalists need to be our own silver bullet, and we need to be thoughtful and smart about how we're using the various opportunities that this insane, eclectic environment has allowed us to use. So,
yeah. I think that's doing.
Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to add from the Twitter perspective too. I want to go back to your earlier point of it being a business partnership now between Twitter and our publishers. Our team, and I'm sure my partners, I see Eric in the room, I see Ravina, our team has evolved to kind of focus on monetization and really think about ways in which we can collaborate in a smart way with our partners where they're rewarded. And so our team has taken over Amplify. And what that means is several different facets to it. So we have Amplify Open, which is an evergreen video monetization program. We have custom sponsorships. Live, within live opportunities, there is mid-roll and pre-roll. And we have, even for Periscope now, we've launched Amplify Custom there, as well as rewarding great broadcasters. We just launched that recently too. And so we understand that, as platforms have evolved, and you guys are often in our test groups, we're constantly testing new features and tools and doing a lot of research around what is resonating with our users. But we can no longer keep doing that with our publishers. We can't look at publishers as guinea pigs. They have to be equal partners to us. And so we feel really strongly that, we don't want to disrupt great journalism that is being created in newsrooms. We want to help, support that and encourage that. And so, through these programs I mentioned, we feel really strongly that in the last couple of years, we've actually seen a lot of good success. And so, as I mentioned, doing live programming with Vox, with BuzzFeed News, we really do think that monetization is key, and we really want to be a pathway for that.
I think that might be a good place to wrap it up and make sure we also have a chance to talk more informally and enjoy the reception that the Town Center has generally provided for this. So, what a wonderful conversation we've had, both with publishers who are women and girls.